Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us at our live stream session today for the New South Wales Government In-House Council Day. I'm Lina Fischer. I'm a partner in the Construction and Major Projects team here in Sydney and joined by my fellow partner, Nikki from our real estate team. But I'm delighted to welcome our guest panellists today. We have David Chandler, who's the New South Wales Building Commissioner. David has an impressive history of more than 40 years experience in the building and construction industry. First on the tools on many projects, including the Australian Parliament House, and also involved in a number of government inquiries, including Deputy Chair of the Building Education Revolution Legislation Review, and most recently as adjunct professor at Western Sydney University, where he's been helping develop the next wave of construction. And joining us also is Elizabeth Stewart, who is David's Director of Legal Operations. Elizabeth has a very long history of working within government, including at DPI and Plan. So we're very lucky to have this team here, and I think we're in safe hands for the future of trying to re-establish confidence of consumers in the New South Wales building industry. Today we'll hear from David and from Elizabeth on the tasks that the New South Wales Government has given them and how they're planning to. And I'm sure you'll all have some burning questions either now or that might arise during the course of the presentation. So I'd encourage you to click on the Q&A on the right-hand side of your screen and put through your questions, and we'll come to those a bit later. Over to you, David.
Well, thank you very much for having us in, and I know that you'll probably hear more intelligent stuff from Elizabeth than you will from me, but Elizabeth's the lead of legal in my office, so I thought it was terribly important that she's part of this conversation. But look, let's first of all say thank you for having us and all of you attending. I see a long list of people, so that's impressive, and hopefully I can share with you just some of the oversight of why we're here, what we aim to achieve, and what we're standing up here and now. It's been a big week because this is the week that the Residential Apartment Buildings Compliance and Enforcement Powers Act was stood up, and so that's only now 4 days old. And I think people are already sensing that that is out there, and hopefully we'll make some very constructive improvements to some of the things that we've been talking about before we came in today. So my appointment is just a year old now, so I think we've achieved a lot. Just looking back and thinking that the RAB Act was conceived at the end of October last year, and it was approved by the Cabinet in December. It was drafted over the Christmas break. It was first put on the table in the House in the first or second week of February, and it was signed off in the upper house with all the crossbenchers in support on the 11th of June. I'm not sure that there's been so much legislation that's gone through at that pace, but certainly it does change the game. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that legislation because perhaps you've got more burning questions than we'll address them as they come. Now look, just quickly, an overview. My job is to actually advocate for the interest of consumers of residential and construction buildings in New South Wales. We're starting with Class 2 buildings. The Minister has made it clear that over the next couple of years, other classes of buildings will be included, or may be included. There'll be no lurch to any other asset class at this stage until such time as we've had about a year of this legislation and we've made sure that there are no unintended consequences of the work we're doing with a specific focus on Class 2. My role includes, and it's quite different to any other regulator in any other state, I'm actually not the regulator. I'm just in a very influential position, excuse me, to influence the development of policy, to influence the development of legislation, to oversee the transformation of the regulator in New South Wales. So I don't have a line management responsibility. I actually simply have a very influential change management power. And that is already being implemented, and the organisation is reacting very positively to the relationship we've built between the Office of the Building Commissioner and the building regulator. Now, the other big part of this is that we have to focus on how are we going to change the culture and capability of this industry, because when I came on board a year ago, everybody was sitting around the table. I think there were over 30 different interest groups at the first table I sat at, and all they did was point to the person over there and say the problem is over there, and none of them realised, in fact, that they were part of the problem. We've now completely got rid of this finger pointing, and I can assure you that at every working group that we have these days, everybody's sitting in the room owning the common problem. How do we change the culture and capability of this industry permanently? So this is not just a flash in the pan. This thing's going to go for long into our future. So that's my role, is to lead those pieces of work. And in our office, which is the Office of Building Commissioner, I've got a director, Matt Press, and the other director is Elizabeth Stewart. Matt Press drives the business, and Elizabeth makes sure that we stay on the straight and narrow. So we've got a pretty capable team of about 15 people in the Office of the Building Commissioner, and that's all we're going to have. We don't need any more people because we're not a layer of a new organisation. We're actually a change management initiative, and we're doing what we would call a sprint project that by the end of 22, we've actually made a significant difference. So people need to understand that it's quite different to the regulator in other states, other jurisdictions in Australia. So we're on that journey now. So I've provided in the pack just a quick overview of the people who are in our organisation. I've provided an overview of the organisations through which I have an influence in terms of developing transformation in the organisation. I've provided some purposeful information for you about what we have on our mind and why we've decided to go along these directions. I think if I could just stop on the Construct New South Wales strategy for a moment and just get everybody to dwell on this pivot. The big pivot that we have elected to do is to move away from focusing on individual players. We're going to focus on groups of players. The run-on team for a project, if you may, the sporting analogy is that we want to look at who is the run-on team for this project and who's the run-on team for that project, and provide an insight into what are their past performances and what's their predictability as a run-on team to produce a trustworthy building. So you'll see the icon shifting from individual players at the top of that little page, moving to groups of players. Now, we're starting off looking at developer, builder, and certifier. So the first triumvirate of people that we're looking at for the run-on team is that group. We've got a very specific reason for that because we believe that developers actually set the tone for the project. They hire the designers to design the project. The designers either engage to do a full complement of work or a partial complement of work. Then a builder tenders on those designs, whether they're complete or not, and they have to make up the rest of it. Well, we think we need better clarity than that. So we're saying to the developers, you set the tone for your project. You're the person who's doing the transaction with the purchase at the end of the day, and you will be the beneficiary of this project once you get the purchasers to settle. To focus your mind, we have a view that the occupation certificate is a really good point in that transaction to have a look before a purchaser moves from being a depositor to an owner. Because once you become an owner, these buildings hang around your neck, and that if they're a bad building, they're a real problem. So the other pivot that we've done is that we've also moved away from looking at individual pieces of a building. I'm not a subscriber to the fact that if you turn up and show me a list of all of the materials you've used and so show me a cert mark or some other form of assurance and say, mate, when this left the factory, job done, this is good stuff, should be good. What we're interested in is, what did it look like when it was installed? Because people can take perfectly good materials and make an absolute mess of them. So we're interested in not the pieces, but when you join up all the parts of the building, have you made a trustworthy building? So trustworthy run-on teams, trustworthy building. That's the game plan that we're playing. So look, the legislative reform landscape, the left-hand box in the pack that you've got just simply says this is what we've done so far, and this is what's coming up. The next piece of work we're very interested in is the strata management area. We've now got a duty holder for design under the Design and Building Practitioners legislation. We've got a duty holder for the declarer of a complying construction in accordance with those designs. some form of duty holder might be appropriate going forward for a strata building, because at this stage, there's quite a number of things that really no one's responsible for doing. So, for example, if a strata building management team is not declaring that they have defects and they're not doing something about them, if they haven't told the Office of Fair Trading about them, then in a way they're not delivering their duty of care, particularly to subsequent owners. So they have a duty, I believe, to the existing owners and occupiers, but they also have a duty to subsequent owners. So there's some buildings that we've seen around for 5, 6, 7 years. The defects and problems have been known in those buildings, and owners' corporations have tried to suppress them, thinking, well, we better not tell anybody about this. Well, the day for that is over. So please start to declare, if you've got defects, start to tell the Office of Fair Trading, because we want to do something about it, but we won't take kindly to not knowing what's going on. If you just keep it as under a rock somewhere, we have no line of sight to it. Now, the next series of slides just simply covered the Act and some background on the legal thinking. That work was largely prepared in conjunction with the Property Council of Australia, and I'm sure some of you were in a briefing that the Property Council of Australia ran with Kari Metcalf giving that overview of that work. So that's all available. If you look at the slide with 2 triangles on it, I just would like to say to you the other pivot that's occurred in the way that we're looking at the regulator is that historically the regulator has been operating at the wrong end of history. They tend to operate in the past 3, 4, 5, 6 years after a building's been finished, when in fact all of the players have left the playing field and they're all gone back to their shed, they've had a beer and they've all gone home and they're sitting in front of TV watching the game again, and one of our regulators comes along and says, oh, by the way, I don't think you played that bit real well and we'd like to talk to you about it. Well, unfortunately, the game is over, the score is already posted, and that is history. What we're wanting to do is to get our regulator to actually flip their effort to the front end. So we're well on the way of doing that, and I'll explain a little bit about that as we move forward. The thing that everyone needs to be aware of is that in the Design and Building Practitioners Act, we are required to go back to the Parliament about March 2022 and put on the table a business plan for what the future regulator will look like. It'll be very radically different to what it is today. It'll be a proactive, very much digitally driven, but also having capability and resources of people who know the business and know how to play the game at the front rather than at the back. So it'll be a very different team going forward. You'll see a reference to ratings tools. It's almost been the question that has dominated all prior presentations. I'm not going to really go into great detail here other than to say that we are joining up data silos that have never ever been connected. And just in a matter of 6 months, the power that we now have to actually assemble data from a range of areas across the regulator and from other agencies is already showing how powerful the use of data is going to be in the future for a regulator who wants to get in front of the game. So all I would suggest is that while people are talking about digital twins, most of that's been applied to the built world, the standing up of buildings and how a digital twin of a building looks like. Please imagine also your own personal digital twin, because by the middle of next year, under the new government licensing platform that we're building, everything you do in the future will follow you forever. So your digital twin attached to your license or your credential as a designer or another key player in the project will follow you forever. So we're focused about not so much the digital twin of what's it look like when it's stood up. We're focused on, yes, but will it stay standing up? So that's the game that we're focused on. The next slide just simply shows you 3 waves of activity, and that's in response to questions that always point to, but Commissioner, how can you drive change if you don't have a commission? How can you drive change if you don't have more resources? 15 doesn't seem like a plausible effort to make the changes that we have in our hands. Well, I made a commitment to the regulator when I came on board is that we weren't going to put a carpet on top of them and simply end up with a whole bunch of new arrivals trying to tell them how to do their business. We were going to collaborate with them and work with them in their business to actually look at the areas where we could improve and to work with them to achieve that improvement. And one of the things that they desperately needed was some new blood. So what we have is an opportunity to use the standing up of the RAB Act and the Design and Building Practitioners Act to bring new blood into the organisation. So already we've got 15 boots on the ground to start providing the investigator support for looking at buildings as we've got power to do under looking at occupation certificate audits. You'll see a red line there. That's another group of resources that will come on board from about the middle of next year. They will help us look at the quality of declared designs, because we want to make sure that we can see that there's a lift in the quality of declared designs straight away. So developers who are thinking of having a building that is going to get to about a CC stage mid next year need to start engaging consultants on the basis that they're going to have to declare their design, because you won't be able to build beyond that date for a building starting at that time unless you've got declared designs, because unless you can have those, you can't end up with declared as-built drawings that reflect the declared design. So there's a bookend type situation there. So we'll have some resources coming on board to support auditing the quality of the declared designs, because we're very interested to see, is there an improvement in the quality of that documentation? And then finally, you'll see some new boots on the ground that will come on board, say, from early 2022. And that group of resources will focus on the quality of the declared as-built drawings. Do they match up with the declared design? But also be aware is that when you see the regulations for the Design and Building Practitioners Bill, you'll see some innovations going on regarding how we're going to use artificial intelligence to actually compare documents. So you'll see that the regulations will require that all drawings use the same DWG file for the declared by box in the bottom right-hand corner. That's my box. So you can put other stuff around that, but the DWG box will be in the bottom right-hand corner, and it'll simply receive the fingerprint, the one-time digital chop of anybody who has declared a design. And that'll go straight back for me to the licensing platform. We can say who did it, when did they do it, and should we be taking up a matter with them? So digital twin in play. The other thing that will happen is that when you upload the declared designs and the declared as-built drawings, that box will help us simply do a scan of both sets of documents to see which is missing on either side of the set. We did a quick trial. We dropped 200 declared declared designs into the box and 200 declared as-built drawings into the box, pressed the button, and it took 3 seconds to compare 400 drawings. So we live in a world where 20 years into this century, we are beginning to be deploying the capabilities that you would expect a regulator to have at their fingertips moving forward. I'm not going to spend any time on the next slide, which is the 6 pillars that form part of our strategy. Many of you would be on working groups involved with that. Maybe you might have a question, but I'm not going to sort of go through that now. The next set of slides just simply outline to you what does an OC audit process look like. I'm also going to take that as read, but I would make one closing comment about it, is that we will be using risk rating capabilities to look at what projects might get an occupation certificate audit. But no one should assume that if you are a recipient of a letter saying you are now going into an occupation certificate audit process, that you're a bad player. It has been essential that we make sure that we test our capability to actually select randomly across the field, as well as some targeted selection. So we do have some targeted selection, but we also are mixing it with random. Now, the only time that really you could be declared as being someone who hasn't turned up with a trustworthy building is if at the end of the OC process, I form a view that we should be delaying the issuance of the occupation certificate. Until then, nobody should make any assumption about a project that is being audited. We're out there to sort of raise the tide And it's quite amazing. There's a lot of people out there who think that it's everybody else who's letting the team down. And they actually are quite surprised we turn up and point out how many times they are letting the team down. So please don't think for a minute that the 4 people who've actually just received their letters are automatically in the naughty corner, because they're not in the naughty corner. They're just going to have an OC audit. So look, I think if on that basis we might open. Liz, is there anything you want to add to that?
Well, let's see where the questions go, and we might sort of talk a little bit more about the legislation and so on, and maybe because it's the government lawyers forum, might be sort of an area that people are interested in.
Yeah, I think one of the things we could usefully do is perhaps discuss some of the things that might be being called in from a project that is getting an OC audit. So maybe in a few minutes you might like to just touch on a couple of those things so that people can see how far and how wide-ranging the documents we're calling in for those projects that are going to have an OC audit.
Yeah.
So maybe you could take those questions when they come in.
Okay.
So you've preempted a couple of questions for me, because one of my first questions was, you know, we know from the press this week that 4 developers had received notification that their projects will be audited, and my question was, are they in the naughty corner? So I'm glad we've clarified they're not in the naughty corner. But how are you making the decision about who to audit and what kind of documentation? I think this goes to the conversation with Elizabeth. What kind of documentation and how extensive is that documentation that you're going to require in order to do this?
I'll let Elizabeth speak to the documentation piece, but let me give the audience a bit of an indicator. We've got a range of filters now that are available to us to actually select the people who probably should get the most attention. So it's not just that people, but where it starts to become very loud to us, okay? We should have imagined this was the case, but it's only just recently become clear, is that we could just simply use a filter that says, list in the order of the most number of safety rectification notices that the builders had during the course of the job to provide the entire risk rating. Because the top 10 builders with the highest number of during construction safety improvement notices will line up with what we think would be the riskiest players that are out there. And they also, when you say, and who are their certifier? Guess what? It's the same stable.
Yeah.
All right. So people should start to imagine now, if I was a client, I'd be paying a lot more attention to making sure that the builder's giving safety compliance a lot of attention, because we think there's a correlation between someone whose attitude is poor on safety compliance is likely to have a poor attitude to building compliance.
Yeah. And I find that a really interesting statement, because a lot of the work that we do in the real estate team and with the MPC team is helping government agencies procure services, and some of them might actually be development of residential towers on their site. And I think when you go back and think about what kinds of questions we're asking, I think this opens up a whole new field. So you want people who are saying, we can deliver this and we have the capability to then come back and say, right, well, how many safety compliance notices have you received on your previous building? That will give you a good idea of the quality of the development. And
we'll have other data that will support briefing those sorts of conversations in the future. But Elizabeth, why don't you just touch on the sort of stuff that's been called in?
So in the letter that goes to the developer, letting them know that there's going to be an OC, I just want to mention what the OC audit is. It's sort of compliant, so it's not just for an enforcement activity. It could end up there, but the way that it starts is more like a coaching or mentoring type of role. We have the new people, the 15 people with backgrounds like architects, engineers, trades, and they have expertise to know what is a compliant building supposed to look like. And they are going to call in these documents, which I'll mention in a second, and they are going to do a desktop review of those and then go out to site and see, does the reality match what the design said it should look like? Is it compliant to the Building Code of Australia? And provide feedback to the developer in a very transparent way about where there are shortcomings. With the intent that in that 6 months period between when the notices come in and when the intended application for the occupation certificate is made, remediation can be done so that you end up with a better building for consumers than you would have had had you not had the OC auditors in place. Obviously, there are going to be some that don't come good. They'll end up in the regulator's patch for attention using powers there. So the list of documents are the sort of group of documents we're calling issued for construction. They're documents that go beyond the construction certificate drawings, but they also include all of the designs and drawings detailed for the different areas that we're looking at. And we're looking at the 5 key building elements because that's where most of the strife is caused for consumers. I'll just mention those. They're fire safety, waterproofing, structural enclosures, which is like the cladding, etc., and services. So they're the 5 key areas that we're focusing on, and we're looking at the designs and drawings of the issued for construction. So some more detail than you would get in construction certificates, but also the contract. So we're looking for contracts to see who is engaged and what have they been engaged to, so that there's quite a detailed picture of where the shift's been allocated. I mean, it's all well and good to keep pushing the risk contractually to a different phase than you would like it to be, but it's got to be sitting with a person who's qualified and able to perform the work in a compliant manner. So the list of documents is a very detailed list, and it's very similar to and based on the list of documents that's in the Strata Schemes Management Act, which also deals with building defects. So there's sort of a match there. It's important to note that these 2 acts fit in a universe of existing legislation and are seeking to be compliant with that. So we've got the Home Building Act still on foot, working in with this, you've got occupation, you move on, you've got statutory warranties, they're still there. We've got your Strata Schemes Management Act with the building defects deposit and different activities that are required there. We've also got the new, as of 1st of July this year, Building and Development Certifiers Act, looking at better performance of certifiers against standards and not taking on the responsibility for performing the building work, however, performing their role in a more professional way as though they are a public official, because that's sort of what they're doing. Yeah. And I'll just mention that we've had published this week the Certifiers Practice Standard under that Act, which gives some very detailed guidance, very clear guidance, so people can't be confused about what the expectations are of a certifier. And so all of those things coming together to the OC auditors to have a look at, to plan their work and their visits, give the feedback, so that at the end of the day, the consumer gets better business.
That sounds great. And it's going to lead me on to one other question, and then we'll go to some of the questions coming up on the board. There is a sense, I think, in the industry that the privatisation of the certification role has led to some of the issues we're seeing consumers having to deal with today. And I just want to get a sense from either of you, actually, whether you think that's the case or you think that's sort of an unfair rap for certifiers.
I think the answer to that is got a number of multiple elements to it. First of all, it's not just simply private certifiers. There has been some poor outcomes where government certifiers, local government certifiers have been the certifier. So, for example, Mascot Towers was certified by the former Botany Council. I'm currently looking at another project at the moment, and it's not because it had a local government certifier. It just picked itself as a project that we needed to have a look at. So now, by and large, I think that there's a really good backbone of private certifiers out there that are really intent on doing the right thing. I've spoken to many of them, and one of the challenges that they have is that when there's an inadequate design and there's a contract for works that actually reflects an inadequate design, it leaves a whole space for work to be made up. What is the answer? A classic example is wet areas. Very few projects I'm going through at the moment have detailed designs for wet areas. It's almost subcontracted to a specialist installer, code for the cheapest price, and the result is what you would expect it to be. So in many instances, I'm seeing good certifiers almost a bit like the meat in the sandwich. A bad design, a builder who's actually built work that he's essentially made up, and then they're under the pump to certify the building. So I think that there's many certifiers out there that would admit to having been compromised. They're really keen to stop that existence. Then there's a bunch of certifiers out there that have just been good all the time and they continue to do good stuff. But there's a very small cluster then of people that are habitually bad certifiers. They know who they are, and they'll find, in fact, that they should be thinking now about a change of career.
I like that. Now, one of the questions that's come up on the screen is, does David think there'll ever be a Crown exemption? And I think leading into that question, I'm going to sort of make it a little bit more layered, and I apologise for that. But I think we do see a number of projects, as I mentioned earlier, where there are soft or government entities that are involved in procuring that work, and sometimes that is viewed as almost being a joint venture. So they might put the land into a development, and then a developer will come in and pay all the cost of building that building, and therefore we do move into the grey area about the public and private working together. So I think in terms of looking at the question around, do we think there'll be a Crown exemption, I think that's an overlay we need to consider. But also I know, David, one of your passions is looking at where we're going with the draft subdivision and management plans and what the long-term arrangements are that are being put in place post-construction, generally where the government entity is stepping out of the arrangement.
So why don't we start with Elizabeth?
I'll start with me. So there isn't currently a Crown exemption from the residential apartment buildings legislation, and not all of it applies to a Crown entity doing development if their planning pathway doesn't involve applying for an occupation certificate. However, all of the powers that are in that Act otherwise do apply and should apply, because if government is using a Crown development pathway, but at the end of the day, a person, a member of the public is buying a residential apartment in a development, it doesn't really matter that the Crown was involved in that development. It should be a good building, it should be a trustworthy building, and they should be able to expect the same standard as anybody else who is buying a unit. So there won't, I mean, you know, speaking from what I understand at the moment and not being the government or the minister, there is not currently a Crown exemption and not a planned one either.
I think it's probably a good point to say that we're open to having some discussions with government agencies to talk about the sorts of things they might like to consider. But you have to realise that if you've got a finger in the pie as a sort of synthetic developer, that you need to realise that everything that attaches to the developer will partially attach to you. And so we're finding that one of the areas is that perhaps government agencies could think about more about what happens post the occupation and what sort of role has the developer set up for themselves to govern their interest as opposed to the interest of the resident. And we're seeing some examples where they're not pretty. There's some very unattractive examples of the post-management arrangement very stacked against residents. So we'll be looking to work with agencies in that space. And from time to time, I will be calling out the exhibits because some of them are just simply not acceptable, and the only way to change behaviour is to call out the exhibits. So expect to see a couple in the not too distant future.
Speaking of that, so once you get to the end of the audit and you're not happy, can you just talk us through what that process is like? And I know you haven't actually done it yet, but you know, if you don't think that the occupation is able to be used, what is the process?
Well, the process, you'll see in the kit that in fact it outlines a staged exercise. Let's assume that it's a typical audit that's had 5 or 6 inspections or audit inspections during the last 6 months. We will be providing the developer with a health check report at the end of every month. So it'll be against those elements that Elizabeth's described, the structure, the waterproofing, the fire systems, etc. And we'll provide the developer with a health check. You'll get a red, yellow, green score, but behind that score will be a report that says the reasoning for that particular score for structure or waterproofing are these reasons. So every month they would get a report that will give them a health check. So as they get towards the end, there should be no surprises. If your health checks have got more amber and red, you're starting to get into trouble. if it's got more green and amber, then things are starting to be more manageable. So you'll see that, and we'll be publishing the aggregate score of all of the projects that are under audit. So the public dashboard will be, here's the average score for these things for everybody, and we'll be able to provide an individual score for the players so that they can actually have a private access to their individual score benchmarked against everybody else. Okay, so if you've got a really bad score on waterproofing, you'll see what the industry average is on waterproofing, and you'll see where you sit. Okay, so no surprises. So if you get to the end and we've given you warnings along the way, we've given you health checks along the way, we're going to bend over backwards to say, you really need to get this sorted. But if at the end of the day, we're just simply push back, well, I have the ability to issue an order to say that the occupation certificate can't be issued at this point until such time as I am happy, and will outline the items that need attention to get to that point where I'll lift that order. Now, the developer has the right to take that decision to the Land and Environment Court and challenge that decision, and as they should, because there's got to be due process. But the order stands until the Land and Environment Court says that I'm wrong. I just don't think the optics will be very good for the person who wants to be the first exhibit.
Yeah, and that also becomes much more public once they bring it action.
Totally, because all of the evidence is the evidence and it's all public. So really, how about we all just focus on making trustworthy buildings? It's going to be a lot easier for everybody.
David, I have a question for you. There's a lot of excitement in the construction industry around new technologies, things like modular buildings. And I know some government agencies are starting to embrace those into some of their building work. Just interested in your thoughts on that. Well, look,
it's a great question, because I think people who have followed my publications over the last couple of years is that I start off with a statement that says that modern construction clients are not modern construction's guinea pigs. So first of all, I think that if you want to be a player playing with what I call innovative solutions, innovative building products, let's just take bathroom pods as an example. Probably 2 years ago, we had 25, 30 people who made bathroom pods. Today, there's probably only 15. All right, so there's 10 of them that are no longer on the dance floor. Well, we've got a cohort of bathrooms out there that have been made by people for which there's nobody around to be accountable. So what we're looking for now is that when we start to do our risk rating from the middle of next year, we'll move that into the designer and then into the manufacturer, because we've got to start to move the regulatory line of sight into the off-site piece, because it's coming. I mean, the project that we're on this week, all the bathrooms were imported from Victoria. All of the plumbing and gas sets on the floor for metered water, metered gas, all of those were prefab. They just came as a standard drop-in. We're seeing that with the electrical systems. We're seeing plug and play with electrical. Everybody knows facades have been coming from another place for years. So we probably could imagine that 30 to 40% of buildings today are actually prefabricated. We have not been regulating them. We've never had certifiers thinking that they should look all the way back to the source. Well, they're going to have to think about that going forward.
And sorry, could I just add something? Just in connection with that idea of innovation, one thing that has come back, and I think which is in one of the pillars that people will have read about, is the lifting in capability. And there are two key areas that I'd just like to mention. One is, out of the OC audit program, there'll be identification of gaps in capability on site. That will be fed back and taken account of in an excellent program that's been put in place in conjunction with the Building Commissioner and TAFE. And that is a portal which provides micro courses which people can do to lift up their capability in various areas. That's live now. The first module is on there, which is about OC audit. You put a very important first topic. But it will be added to in due course by things that are identified through that OC audit. So that will be of a double repay of not only for the particular development, which will get the feedback about something that's not gone right, but it will come back and get into the industry that people can do a course and lift up their capability by doing that. That's the one area. But the other area is the case studies that will come out of all of these things, and that will be published so that the industry, and innovative products is one of those. Case studies might be used to demonstrate, what went awry or what went well, possibly, and then people beyond the particular project will get the benefit of that. So I think that's really important, so that learning is not lost.
And it starts early.
And it starts early.
I think it's important to say to you what's not innovation. Okay, so what is not innovation is a D&C subcontract where you take the design and hand it to a subcontractor to say, mate, you do a D&C on this and cut it to pieces, and you come up with a solution and give me the best possible price for that. Now, we call that construct and design, okay? Because what happens is we end up with this absolutely failed solution, and that was supposed to be innovation. That's not innovation, okay?
No, thank you. That was really helpful, and I didn't realise paper's involved in that way.
It's fantastic. You should have a look at it.
I will. Yeah. What I was going to ask is, I watched the presentation you did recently with Chris Duggan from the Strata Communities Australia organisation, and one of the topics that came up there briefly was companies, developers in particular, that have gone out of business. So while we use the term Phoenix themselves, and we see that quite a bit, where we'll get calls from clients to say we had this developer on a project, they just into insolvency or receivership, and they want us to transfer the contract into a different name. So where the original developer has disappeared and you have identified and you're within the time frame that there is an issue with that development, how are you going to manage through that?
Well, there's a range of things. First of all, we're going to make being a Phoenixer in New South Wales a very unattractive business model.
Yep.
Okay, so if you are a habitual failer of businesses, then expect to see your project getting an occupation certificate audit every time. Okay, so first of all, if you are a habitual walker away of projects, expect to see us very often. The other message is that if you are an administrator or a liquidator and you stand in the shoes of the developer, you are the developer. As far as I'm concerned, I'll be treating you as the developer. I know that most of the people who stand in those shoes, their role is underwritten by the bank or whatever. So my view is, well, if you're a bank and you're putting a receiver or an administrator into a liquidator into a project, that I'm seeing that person as the developer. So we'll be pushing really hard on that. I've got one project at the moment where I'm going to be really pushing ATSIC, because quite often there's never enough around at the end of the day for anybody to take on that battle to say, how do we make sure these people stay in the naughty corner forever? All right, well, I'm going to be pushing really hard on behalf of the public to make sure that where we have examples of people who have left a bad company behind, I want them to stay in the naughty corner for a very long time. So the game's changed for anyone who thinks that this is a clever business model. If you still think that, go to Queensland or go to Victoria, but don't do it under my watch in New South Wales.
And it might be something for government to think about then as well. We're doing arrangements with developers who may then Phoenix down the track, and 6 years later, government's the only one standing. So,
look, Phoenixing has very many variations. Okay, so a company doesn't need to actually become liquidated to create a synthetic Phoenix. We're seeing companies that are just allowed to go to sleep, so they just hang around, but they haven't really become insolvent. So they're put to sleep. So they sit there and they become this inner thing that you can punch away at all you like, but you can't do anything with them. So there are many versions of Phoenixing.
There are also a couple of extra little considerations there. One is the Strata Schemes Management Act, where contracts signed after the 1st of January 2018 are starting to come through, and there's a requirement for a 2% building bond to be lodged. Gives a little bit of cash for the defects to be remedied and a process there. So we've seen a flood of bonds being lodged because one obstacle to getting an occupation certificate because of the RAB Act is lodge your bond. So that's seen a big spike, which is really good. I always like seeing compliance with existing legislation. And the second thing is that once we get the Design and Building Practitioners Act in full swing, you know, a person has to give a declaration that they built a building properly. A designer has to give a declaration that they have designed the building in a compliant way. And, you know, eventually as-built drawings have to be lodged. It becomes a sort of a personal thing. A person's putting their name to it. Yes, it's the firm that signed this, the digital twin. And so hopefully there'll be some level of professionalism that comes in to drive behaviour. Obviously, money is more persuasive perhaps than, you know, professional pride perhaps in some quarters, but that is also an element that, you know, people might be reluctant to deal with somebody that is just,
We think there are lots of good people in the industry, and those that are happy to be held accountable and be proud of the work that they do will then, I think in David's words, flourish and be the ones that you look to as sort of setting that benchmark at a very high standard. And those that are not, you're sitting in the naughty corner. We won't be too proud of.
I think there's another question that's probably lingering out there that someone hasn't asked yet, and that is all of this going to drive up the cost of construction? And that's almost a repeat question at every one of these forums. And the bottom line is this, that I reckon that there's 60 to 70% of players out there that are doing a very fine job, and they tell me that this won't mean one single dollar to the increase of the way they do buildings. For the people who are doing the shonkiest buildings, the people who are cutting the corners and ripping costs out and simply not turning up with the goods, I call that cost shifting. So putting the cost shift back into the actual cost of construction, that's not going to drive up the cost of construction. That's just going to be taking inappropriately taken profits and putting them back into the building.
Yep.
So I don't expect to see this driving up the cost of construction. So there's a couple more questions up there. So
yeah, and I think it's quite a long question, so we've just broken it up so that for those of us who are a little bit more older than others, we can read it. And I think it's a really good question. So it's really about how do you plan to manage situations where other government agencies might be expected to have expertise in a particular area, and the example that's given is fire safety, but they don't have the in-house resources to deal with problems on a granular day-to-day level, or there are multiple accountable bodies. So councils, private certifiers, the different people with different roles that all lead into hopefully the same outcome. And how are you going to deal with sort of the issues where there's either duplication or people not fulfilling their roles so that you get that outcome?
Well, the Designer Building Practitioners Act actually makes it very clear as to what design is and what standard of design to be achieved. So you'll have principal designers, but you'll have designers of the critical elements, the structure, the waterproofing systems, etc. Now, you can't allocate that responsibility to another person. Okay, so there'll be more clarity about who did what and who's responsible for doing it. And the same thing will exist on the other side, that when you make the building, it'll be very clear that a contractor can't contract out the responsibility to actually perform the building in accordance with the contract and the building codes of Australia. So there'll be no questionability about that. I don't believe that any particular agency needs to have expertise in fire safety or any of those sorts of areas. They should be able to rely on properly engaged teams of designers and properly engaged teams of building makers to put a building together and turn up with the goods at the end of the day. So the first question is, yeah, look, I just don't think agencies should be even imagining that they have to upskill in any particular discipline expertise to make a building. But what they do need to be very careful about is make sure that they don't skim on the quality of the design or the making of the building that they are about to attempt.
I think that one of the issues I've seen when we've been dealing with, and I'll use the government example, some councils who have issues with developing the product in their government area, is if they have, got it wrong and issued the occupation certificate, there is this concern internally that, the developer goes, well, you said it was okay, so it must be okay. So it's sort of, I do wonder whether that's what's driving that question to some extent, which is why, I really like the operation of the Act that says there is very clear lines of responsibility and accountability for who is responsible for each portion of delivering that building.
So a couple of things to just sort of say that, we've got a very clear way forward so that these sorts of ambiguities don't reside. So, for example, a future CC will have to nominate the intended occupancy sequence of a building, so that the declared designs all have to declare themselves as being declared designs that are suitable to enable that occupancy sequence of a building. So that could be the station box, it could be the retail, it could be some office buildings, and then it could be some residential. So you'll have to declare that at the CC stage. If you want to change the occupancy sequence, you have to go back and amend the CC, and all of the designers will have to redeclare to say that, in fact, that the designs respond to the changed occupancy sequence. Going forward, you won't be having a interim occupation certificate. Okay, so that's been one of the cancers, is that certifiers have thought, well, a way to get through this is just simply issue an occupation certificate, an interim occupation certificate. Now, that's left many buildings in a very difficult situation, because if the certifier is no longer an accredited certifier, it creates a problem as to, well, who's going to issue the final OC? And of course, that does fall back to council in many occasions. So I've got a couple of those we're dealing with at the moment, and they're not a pretty sight. But look, there's clarity going forward, I believe. I don't think that you should think that there's confusion between councils and private certifiers. It's a very clear line of sight to who does what. And we haven't mentioned the e-planning portal, the platform. And I have to say that DPI have built this amazing piece of kit, and it's now standing up. It's got some funky little pieces at the moment while people are learning how to use it, but it'll be good to go. By the time we get to the 1st of July next year, this will be like very smooth operation. But for us as a regulator, they have built into that platform now all of the intersection points that we need as a regulator to move forward. We think that for a regulator, we will take 60% of our future single source of truth from the DPI platform. That's good news for taxpayers, because the duplications of data that's been around everybody's little silos and the inaccessibility, the opaqueness of that data, all comes back onto a single portal. By the 1st of January next year, all of the LGAs will be on that portal, and developers will also benefit from that, because they'll now see how their projects are going anytime, anywhere. Government will be able to see which councils are lagging, which ones aren't. So it'll be a really purposeful single source of truth for all of the players who have an interest in designing and making buildings.
So just staying on that data point for a moment, and I know you're quite passionate about data and technology, and a lot of this is based on that. Where you have done an audit of someone, what is the ability, and I'm not sure there is a great ability at the moment, to share that information on an intergovernment basis? But I know it won't publish, and I think that's appropriate in terms of the individual audits that people do. But
So what sort of sharing do you mean?
So
like warning about this particular developer?
Yeah, so if there's an example where someone, over in a particular council has dealt with a developer where the outcome has been incredibly poor, and another council might be looking at doing some sort of arrangement where that developer's going to build on their land and sell apartments, is there an ability to share that information?
So between New South Wales Government Agency, there is an ability to share it. We'd have to think about the sharing outside the state government area, but I think that's the area that's something we're heading towards, not just for sharing with local councils, but with, more broadly, other consumers even. You want to know, if you're buying a building, what the developer's rating is. And so we're looking at that sort of thing. At the moment, the internal sharing of all the different data silos which have been made into a data lake, and that we've got sort of a single view of building from the existing information is quite a wealth of information. That information is not publicly available. It's not available on a public register, so it couldn't be shared outside. Yeah. But I think we're heading in the direction where that could be possible.
And we're in the final stages of assessing a tender for an external party to provide a private sector provided rating capability. We require that agency is a regulated organisation, so it has to be one of the proper ratings agencies. They have to be accountable for the ratings they give. They have to be able to report to the regulator each year as to those people who've complained against the rating and how that was rectified. So we want to build that capability as a industry side resource. So progressively, what I'd like to see is a shrinking of what we do in terms of the data that we're building, and an expansion of what's available by the sector. I think that by July next year, that capability will be there. It'll be available to banks, insurers, and other interested parties to buy that as a service, just like you would buy something from CoreLogic out of the land management system.
Yeah, and so that focus is on developers. Would you look to expand that to builders as well down the track?
The multi-party rating tool actually looks at the run-on team, so it'll provide an aggregate rating. So that's the innovation here, is that, and we're also building this so that this particular capability is not a New South Wales jurisdictional solution. I'm not into any more solutions that are designed to solve a particular jurisdiction's requirement. So the multi-party rating tool we're saying must look as though it could be a global solution, because if we could create New South Wales as a sandpit for these sorts of innovations for a global reach, we're also just closed a tender for a building assurance system will allow us to build onto a single platform all of the certificates that are required for building into one platform where you can see every certificate. So whether it's a sprinkler head coming from China or a piece of glass coming from Belgium, all of the certificates for that will be on a single platform. We're looking at blockchain potentially for that application. And I think we're down to the final three who we're talking to. Hopefully another month or two we'll know a bit better who's going to do that. But the insurance industry wants that because they will be the biggest buyer, because they're actually looking to get to a point where each individual building has its own assurance beta. Yeah. So if it has that, then they can actually say, well, that building's premium is going to be a bit more than that one, and that one's a bit more than that one. That'll become the driver of change eventually.
Yes, it would. I think that's fantastic. And someone's raised the issue about compliance costs, but I think we have covered that. And even that piece of information where you have a tool that you can go and see how everybody's rated will actually take some of the compliance work out of it.
Well, the duplications that are in the system already are really unsustainable. I really hope that by the end of 2022, the testimony from the industry is that we've come up with more productive, more agile solutions to provide the best information that's ever been available, and the cost of compliance has gone down.
That would be a fantastic outcome. Now, we're running out of time, so there are no further questions. So I would really like to thank both Elizabeth and David for joining us today. I love the analogy of the run-on team. I think, now we're going to see hopefully a focus in the industry on who's on the team to begin with. Like, how do you get that position on the team? A pretty good halftime check-in, how we're going, so that we're not just looking at the video footage at the end to see what we did wrong. So it's an exciting time. I think it's long overdue, and it sounds like it's in such capable hands. And you've been so generous with your time, both of you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us in. It's been very helpful, hasn't it? Cheers.
Thank you.
And we'll take any further questions that people want to send in.
Sure. We'll talk forward and on to